On April 24th, 1915, at 3:30 a.m., a German patrol of 14 men moved through no man's land near Ypres, Belgium. The temperature was 6 degrees Celsius. A thick fog hung over the battlefield, reducing visibility to 20 meters. The men were part of the 54th Reserve Division, experienced soldiers who had been fighting since 1914. They were on a reconnaissance mission, probing Canadian lines, looking for weak points, counting wire gaps, mapping machine gun positions. They moved carefully, quietly, their boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. They had done this dozens of times before. They knew the ground. They knew the risks. They saw no one. They heard nothing but the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of a flare. They were wrong. The first shot came from nowhere. A flat, sharp crack that was instantly swallowed by the fog. The man at the back of the patrol, a corporal, simply fell forward into the mud. No cry, no warning. He was just gone. The lieutenant at the front froze. He held up his fist. The patrol stopped. They scanned the mist. Nothing. Just gray. Just silence. The second shot came 8 seconds later. The soldier second from the back dropped. This time, the others heard it. Not the shot itself, but the faint whisper of the bullet passing through the fog. Panic. The patrol dove for the nearest shell crater, but there was no cover in no man's land, just mud, wire, and corpses. The shots kept coming, methodical, patient, precise. Crack. A soldier trying to crawl toward the German lines fell still. Crack. The man next to him jerked and lay motionless. Crack. Crack. In less than 4 minutes, 9 men were dead. The 5 survivors didn't retreat. They couldn't. The moment they moved, they died. So they lay in the mud, frozen, praying they wouldn't be next. They lay there for 6 hours, until darkness fell. When they finally crawled back to their lines, their report made no sense. There was no muzzle flash. There was no sound of movement. There was no indication of where the shooter was positioned. It was as if the bullets came from the fog itself. What those soldiers didn't know, what the entire German army on the Western Front was about to learn, was that the fog wasn't empty. It contained a hunter. A 24-year-old Ojibwe man from the forests of northern Ontario. A man so silent, so invisible, he was called Benesi, the Thunderbird. A man who didn't fight the trench war. He stalked it. And he was about to become the most effective sniper in the entire First World War. This is the story of Francis Pegahmagabow and the ancient woodland tracking trick that made him the deadliest soldier on the Western Front. To understand how a single Indigenous man could terrorize an army, you first have to understand the land that shaped him. Francis Pegahmagabow was not born into a world of trenches and barbed wire. He was born in March 1889 on the Perry Island Indian Reserve, now known as Wasauksing First Nation, on the shore of Georgian Bay, in northern Ontario. He was Ojibwe, a member of the Anishinaabe people who had lived in these forests for thousands of years. His mother died when he was 3. His father couldn't care for him alone. Francis was raised by his grandfather and grandmother, Noah and Mary Nanabush, who lived deep in the bush, far from the reserve. This was not a farm. This was wilderness. The forests of northern Ontario are ancient, dense, and unforgiving. Towering white pines, thick undergrowth, rocky terrain. The winters are brutal, with temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius, snow piling 6 feet deep, ice covering every lake and stream. The summers are short, the mosquitoes are thick, and the wildlife is sparse and wary. To survive here, you don't conquer the land. You become part of it. Francis's grandfather was a traditional hunter and trapper. He followed the old ways, the ways of the Anishinaabe that had been passed down for generations. He taught Francis the skills that most white settlers had forgotten, skills that modern armies didn't understand, skills that would make Francis Pegahmagabow the ghost of the Western Front. The first lesson was silence. In the Ontario forests, noise means death. Not your death. The deer's death. The rabbit's death. The moose's death. If you snap a twig, the animal hears it and vanishes. If your clothing rustles, the animal detects it and runs. If you breathe too loudly, the animal smells you and disappears. The white-tailed deer of northern Ontario can hear a twig snap from 200 yards away. They can detect movement in their peripheral vision at 300 degrees. They can smell human scent from half a mile downwind. They are ghosts. To hunt them, you must become a ghost. Francis's grandfather taught him to move through the forest like water, like wind, like shadow. He learned to step on the balls of his feet, testing each step before committing his weight. He learned to place his foot on solid ground, on rocks, on roots, never on leaves or twigs. He learned to move with the wind, so his scent wouldn't carry. He learned to approach from downwind, always, even if it meant taking 3 times longer to reach his position. He learned to freeze mid-step if a branch moved or a bird stopped singing, because the forest speaks. A crow cawing means a predator is near. A squirrel chattering means something has disturbed it. A deer snorting means it's sensed danger. Francis learned to read these signs. He learned to be part of the forest's rhythm, not an intruder in it. His grandfather taught him to wear soft leather moccasins, not hard boots, to wear earth-toned clothing without buttons or buckles that could catch on branches or reflect light, to move only when the wind moved, so his sounds would blend with the rustling of leaves. By the time he was 10 years old, Francis could walk through dry leaves without making a sound. He could move through brush without disturbing a single branch. He could cross a frozen lake without leaving a clear track, walking on wind-blown snow that wouldn't compress. His grandfather would test him. He would send Francis into the forest and tell him to approach within 10 feet without being detected. The first time, Francis made it 30 feet before his grandfather turned and pointed at him. The 10th time, Francis made it 5 feet. The 20th time, Francis touched his grandfather's shoulder before the old man knew he was there. The second lesson was patience. White hunters, Francis's grandfather told him, were always in a hurry. They crashed through the forest, fired at anything that moved, and went home empty-handed. They didn't understand that hunting wasn't about chasing, it was about knowing. But the Anishinaabe hunter doesn't chase. He waits. He finds where the animal will be, and he becomes part of the landscape. He becomes a tree, a rock, a piece of the earth. Francis learned to sit motionless for hours. Not just still, motionless. No fidgeting, no scratching, no shifting weight, no swatting mosquitoes, even when they covered his face and neck. He learned to control his breathing, to slow his heartbeat, to enter a meditative state where his body became a tree, a rock, a shadow. His grandfather taught him to find a position and commit to it, to arrive before dawn when the animals were still sleeping, to set up downwind of a game trail, to cover himself with branches, with leaves, with dirt, to become invisible not by hiding, but by becoming part of the environment. He learned to read the forest, to see the broken twig that meant a deer had passed within the last hour, to see the pressed grass that meant a rabbit had hidden here recently, to see the scratch marks on bark that meant a bear was marking territory, to see the scat on the trail and know what animal left it, how long ago, and which direction it was traveling. He learned to predict where animals would go, based on wind, weather, and terrain. Deer move to high ground when storms approach. Moose bed down near water in the heat of summer. Rabbits run in circles when frightened, always returning to their warren. His grandfather taught him to think like the animal, to anticipate its next move, to be where it would be, not where it was. And Francis was patient. He could sit for 10 hours without moving. He could wait 3 days for the right shot. He learned that the hunter who could wait the longest would eat the most. The third lesson was the shot. Francis's grandfather gave him a .22 rifle when he was 12 years old. Ammunition was expensive. Every bullet mattered. The rule was simple. 1 shot, 1 kill. If you miss, you don't eat. If you wound the animal, it suffers, and you shame yourself. Francis learned to aim not at where the animal was, but where it would be. He learned deflection, windage, and drop by instinct, not by calculation. He learned to shoot between heartbeats, in the moment of absolute stillness. By the time Francis was a teenager, he was the best hunter on the reserve. He could track a deer for 3 days through snow and bring it down with a single shot at 200 yards. He could call in moose using birch bark horns his grandfather carved. He could trap beaver, mink, and fox without ever being seen. The elders called him Benesi, the Thunderbird, because he struck from nowhere and disappeared like lightning. But Francis didn't just hunt. He worked. He trapped for fur traders, selling pelts to buy supplies. He worked as a guide for white hunters and fishermen who came north looking for adventure. He worked on steamships that traveled Georgian Bay, loading cargo, repairing engines. He was quiet, respectful, and competent. But he was also Indigenous. And in the 1910s Canada, that meant he was a second-class citizen. He couldn't vote. He couldn't own land off the reserve. He couldn't enter certain businesses. He was subject to the Indian Act, a law that controlled every aspect of Indigenous life. He saw his people struggling. He saw the poverty on the reserves. He saw the residential schools, where Indigenous children were taken from their families and forbidden to speak their language. But Francis had something most Indigenous men didn't have. He had skills. Skills the world was about to need. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war. The Canadian government called for volunteers. They needed 25,000 men. They got 45,000 in the first month. Young men from across Canada rushed to enlist. They saw it as an adventure, a chance to see Europe, a chance to prove themselves. Francis Pegahmagabow was living in Parry Sound, working odd jobs, when he heard the call. He was 25 years old. He had a wife, Eva Twance, and a young daughter. He had every reason to stay home. But Francis had heard stories from the elders about the War of 1812, about Tecumseh and the Indigenous warriors who fought alongside the British. He believed that by fighting for Canada, he could prove the worth of Indigenous people. He could earn respect. He could change minds. On August 23, 1914, Francis walked into the recruiting office in Parry Sound. The recruiter looked at him skeptically. Indigenous men were not supposed to enlist. The Canadian government had a policy. Status Indians were exempt from military service. The reasoning was paternalistic and racist. They claimed Indigenous men were not capable of modern warfare. They claimed they would be a liability. But the army needed men, and Francis Pegahmagabow was 6 feet tall, powerfully built, and clearly fit. The recruiter took him. Francis was assigned to the 1st Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force. He was given the service number 1096. He was sent to Valcartier Camp in Quebec for basic training. And that's where the problems began. The Canadian Army in 1914 was not ready for Francis Pegahmagabow. Their training was based on European warfare. Stand in a line, fire in volleys, charge with bayonets. Francis had never stood in a line in his life. He had never fired in a volley. He had never charged anything. He stalked. He hid. He waited. His instructors tried to break him of his habits. They told him to march in step. He moved too quietly. They told him to fire on command. He waited too long, aiming for precision instead of volume. They told him to follow orders without thinking. But Francis had been taught to think like the forest, to adapt, to improvise. His fellow soldiers didn't know what to make of him. He was quiet. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't brag. He spoke in broken English, more comfortable in Ojibwe. Some soldiers respected him. Others mocked him, called him chief, called him the Indian. But Francis didn't care. He was there to fight. In September 1914, the 1st Battalion shipped out to England for advanced training. Then, in February 1915, they crossed the Channel to France. They were sent to the Ypres salient, a bulge in the Allied lines that jutted into German territory. It was one of the most dangerous positions on the Western Front, and Francis Pegahmagabow was about to turn it into his hunting ground. The Western Front in 1915 was a nightmare. Two massive armies faced each other across a strip of devastated land called No Man's Land. Trenches zigzagged for hundreds of miles, from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Between the trenches was mud, shell craters, barbed wire, and corpses. The doctrine was simple. Hold your trench. Shell the enemy trench. Send men over the top to capture the enemy trench. Die by the thousands. Machine guns, artillery, and gas made it a slaughter. The average life expectancy of a soldier in the trenches was 6 weeks. But Francis Pegahmagabow didn't fight like a trench soldier. He fought like an Ojibwe hunter. His commanding officers quickly realized he had skills no other soldier possessed. He could move through no man's land without being seen. He could navigate in the dark without a compass. He could find enemy positions by reading tracks in the mud. They made him a scout, then a sniper, then a legend. Francis's first trick was his movement. While other soldiers crashed through no man's land, their equipment clanking, their boots sucking in the mud, Francis moved like fog. He learned the rhythm of the battlefield. He knew when artillery would fire. He knew when sentries would change. He knew when machine gunners would pause to reload or light cigarettes. And he moved in those moments. He didn't crawl, crawling left tracks. He moved in a crouch, using shell craters for cover, timing his movement to the sounds of the battlefield. He wore no helmet. Helmets glinted. He blackened his face with mud. He removed anything that made noise. No mess kit, no canteen, no bayonet. Just his rifle, his ammunition, and his instincts. His second trick was his positioning. German snipers liked height. They set up in ruined buildings, in church towers, in trees. They wanted a clear view. Francis did the opposite. He set up low, in shell craters, in drainage ditches, in the ruins of farmhouses hidden among rubble. He would arrive at a position at 2 a.m., before dawn, and not move for 16 hours. He would urinate where he lay. He would eat nothing. He would become part of the earth. German soldiers would walk past him, 10 meters away, and not see him. His third trick was his shot. Francis didn't shoot like a military sniper. Military snipers were trained to aim for center mass, the torso, the largest target. Francis aimed for the head. Always. A headshot meant instant death. No crying out. No alerting others. The target just dropped. His rifle was a Ross rifle, a Canadian-made bolt-action rifle that was notorious for jamming in mud. Other soldiers hated it, but Francis loved it. It was accurate, deadly accurate, at long range. And he kept it clean, spotless. He would spend hours cleaning it, oiling it, treating it like a living thing. By April 1915, Francis Pegahmagabow had killed over 30 German soldiers. But the worst was yet to come. On April 22, 1915, the Germans launched the Second Battle of Ypres, and they brought a new weapon, a weapon that would change warfare forever. At 5 p.m., German artillery opened fire on the French colonial positions north of the Canadian lines. The barrage lasted 2 hours. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in the French trenches, tearing men apart, collapsing dugouts. It was a standard pre-assault bombardment. The French soldiers hunkered down and waited for it to end. Then, at 6 p.m., the shelling stopped. Silence. The French soldiers looked over their parapets, expecting a German infantry attack. This was the pattern. Shell, then charge. What they saw was a cloud. A yellow-green cloud, rolling across no man's land like a living thing. It hugged the ground, flowing into shell craters, seeping into trenches, moving with the wind. It was thick, opaque, unnatural. Some soldiers thought it was a smokescreen. They weren't worried. Then the cloud reached the first French trenches, and men began to die. The cloud was chlorine gas, 168 tons of it. Released from 5,730 cylinders the Germans had buried in their trenches. It was heavier than air, so it sank into trenches and dugouts where men had taken shelter. It reacted with the moisture in lungs, creating hydrochloric acid. Men breathed it in, and their lungs dissolved. They drowned in their own fluids. The French colonial troops, Algerian and Moroccan soldiers, had no warning, no gas masks, no training. They didn't know what was happening. They inhaled the gas, and within seconds, they were choking, gasping, clawing at their throats. Their skin turned yellow-green. Their eyes burned. They coughed up blood and foam. They fell to the ground, convulsing, dying in agony. Within minutes, thousands of French colonial troops were dead or fleeing in panic, streaming back from the trenches, leaving their weapons, their wounded, everything. They ran through the Canadian positions, eyes streaming, mouths open, unable to speak, just pointing back at the yellow-green cloud. A gap 4 miles wide opened in the Allied lines. The road to the Channel ports was open. The Germans advanced behind the gas, wearing primitive respirators, cautiously moving forward. If they broke through, they would reach Calais, Dunkirk, Boulogne. They would cut off the British Expeditionary Force. They would trap hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. They would win the war. The Canadian divisions, including Francis's 1st Battalion, were ordered to counterattack, to move forward into the gas, to plug the gap, to stop the Germans. It was suicide. The Canadians had no gas masks. Gas masks didn't exist in any army in April 1915. They were told to urinate on cloth and hold it over their faces. The ammonia in urine would partially neutralize the chlorine gas. It was a desperate, improvised, barely effective measure, but it was all they had. The Germans attacked. They came in waves. The Canadians held. Barely. Men died by the hundreds. The gas came again and again. For 3 days, the Canadians held the line at Ypres. They stopped the German advance. They saved the Channel ports. And Francis Pegahmagabow was in the middle of it. While other soldiers cowered in trenches, Francis went hunting. He moved through the gas clouds, using wet cloth over his face. His eyes burned. His lungs screamed. But he kept moving. He found German positions. He killed their officers. He killed their machine gunners. He killed their runners carrying messages. He disrupted their entire advance. On the second day of the battle, Francis was alone in no man's land when he saw a German squad setting up a machine gun position. 7 men. If they got that gun operational, it would slaughter the Canadian line. Francis had one option. He opened fire. He shot the gunner, reloaded, shot the assistant gunner, reloaded, shot the officer. The other Germans dove for cover, but Francis kept firing, methodically, precisely. He killed all 7. Then he crawled forward, grabbed the machine gun, and dragged it back to Canadian lines. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Loomis, wrote in his report, "Private Pegahmagabow showed utter disregard for his own safety and extraordinary courage. He is the bravest man I have ever seen." By the end of the Second Battle of Ypres, Francis had killed 49 German soldiers, confirmed kills, and he had saved his battalion by delivering messages through enemy fire, guiding lost units back to friendly lines, and single-handedly disrupting German attacks. He was awarded the Military Medal for Bravery. It was the first of 3 he would earn, making him one of the most decorated Indigenous soldiers in Canadian history. But the war didn't end. It ground on, year after year, battle after battle. Somme, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele. Francis fought in all of them. He became a legend. German soldiers called him the Ghost, or the Indian Death. They put a bounty on him. They sent counter-snipers specifically to hunt him. They never succeeded. Francis's kill count kept climbing. By 1916, he had over 200 confirmed kills. By 1917, over 300. His fellow Canadian soldiers revered him. His officers relied on him, but they also feared him, because Francis wasn't just a sniper. He was a scout, a runner, and a messenger. The most dangerous job on the Western Front was carrying messages between units. Radio was unreliable. Telephone lines were cut by artillery. Messages had to be carried by hand, across no man's land, through machine gun fire and artillery barrages. Runners had a life expectancy measured in days. Francis volunteered for every mission. He ran messages through barrages that killed everyone else. He guided entire companies through German lines in the dark. He once carried a wounded officer on his back for 3 kilometers through enemy territory. He was wounded 3 times, once by shrapnel, once by a bullet through his leg, once by gas exposure. Each time, he recovered and returned to the front. His commanders tried to promote him. They wanted to make him a sergeant, a lieutenant. But the Canadian Army had a problem. They didn't want an Indigenous man commanding white soldiers. So they gave him medals instead, 3 military medals. And in 1918, just before the war ended, they gave him something else: recognition. On November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed. The war ended. Francis Pegahmagabow had survived. He had fought in every major Canadian battle of the war. He had 378 confirmed kills, more than any other sniper in World War I from any nation. He had captured 300 German soldiers single-handedly. He was, without question, the most effective sniper in the entire war. But when Francis returned to Canada in 1919, he didn't receive a hero's welcome. Francis came home to Perry Island in the spring of 1919. He expected things to have changed. He had fought for Canada. He had bled for Canada. He had killed for Canada. He had proven that Indigenous men were warriors, heroes, equals. Surely that would count for something. He was wrong. Nothing had changed. The Indian Act was still in force. Indigenous people still couldn't vote in federal or provincial elections. They still couldn't leave the reserve without a pass from the Indian agent. They couldn't hire a lawyer to fight for their rights without government permission. They couldn't gather in groups of more than 3 without permission. Their children were still being taken to residential schools where they were beaten for speaking their language. Francis had fought for freedom, but he returned to a reservation that was essentially a prison. He tried to readjust. He married his sweetheart, Eva. They had children. He worked as a guide, as a trapper, as a laborer. But he couldn't escape what he had seen, what he had done. Francis suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1919, they called it shell shock, if they called it anything at all. For Indigenous veterans, there was no recognition, no treatment, no support. Francis had nightmares. He would wake up in the night, sweating, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. He would hear artillery in thunderstorms. He would see German soldiers in the shadows. He drank to quiet the memories. He got into fights when other men disrespected him, when they called him chief, or said that Indians were lazy, good for nothing. He was arrested multiple times for public intoxication, for disturbing the peace. The war hero was now seen as a drunk, a troublemaker. But Francis refused to be silent. He saw what was happening to his people. He saw the poverty on the reserves, the lack of education, the lack of opportunity. He saw veterans, men who had fought alongside him, denied the same benefits that white veterans received. White veterans received land grants. Indigenous veterans received nothing. White veterans received pensions. Indigenous veterans were told they didn't qualify. It was a betrayal, and Francis fought back. In 1921, he was elected chief of the Perry Island Band. He was 32 years old. He immediately began advocating for Indigenous rights. He wrote letters to members of Parliament, to the Prime Minister, to anyone who would listen. He demanded that Indigenous veterans receive the same benefits as white veterans. He demanded that Indigenous children receive proper education, not just industrial training, at residential schools. He demanded that the government honor the treaties that had been signed generations earlier. The Canadian government didn't want to hear it. The Indian agent on Perry Island, a man named W.J. McPherson, saw Francis as a threat. McPherson worked to undermine him, to discredit him. He wrote reports calling Francis a troublemaker, an agitator, a drunk. He recommended that Francis be removed as chief. And in 1925, the government did exactly that. They used a provision in the Indian Act that allowed them to remove elected chiefs without cause. Francis was devastated, but he didn't give up. He continued to fight. He joined the Brotherhood of Canadian Indians, an Indigenous rights organization. He traveled to Ottawa to testify before government committees. He spoke about the injustices, the broken promises, the systematic oppression of Indigenous people. And slowly, painfully, some people began to listen. In 1960, Indigenous people in Canada finally won the right to vote. 42 years after Francis had fought for a country that wouldn't let him be a citizen. Francis Pegahmagabow died on August 5, 1952, at the age of 63. He was buried in a simple grave on Perry Island. For decades, his story was forgotten. The Canadian military didn't acknowledge him. History books didn't mention him. He was just another dead Indian. But in the late 20th century, historians began to uncover his record. They found his service records. They found the testimonies of soldiers who served with him. They found the German reports that mentioned the Indian sniper. And they realized Francis Pegahmagabow was the deadliest sniper of World War I. More effective than any German, British, French, or American sniper. And he had done it using skills passed down for thousands of years. In 2016, the Canadian government unveiled a statue of Francis Pegahmagabow in Parry Sound. In 2019, a bridge was named after him. In 2021, he was inducted into the Canadian Military Hall of Fame. His story is finally being told. This is the ripple effect. This is the piano wire that changed history. Francis Pegahmagabow's actions on the Western Front didn't just kill Germans. They proved something the world wanted to ignore. They proved that Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous skills, Indigenous warriors were not relics of the past. They were effective. They were deadly. They were equal. The Canadian military eventually learned this lesson. In World War II, they actively recruited Indigenous soldiers. They created specialized units like the 1st Special Service Force, which used Indigenous tracking and stalking techniques. Indigenous soldiers became scouts, snipers, and code talkers. But it took Francis Pegahmagabow proving it first. That's how wars are truly won. Not by grand strategies or superior weapons, but by individuals who see the flaw in the system and break through it. James McKenna, the mechanic, saw a flaw in the P-38's control cables. He saw 3/8 of an inch of slack that meant death, and he fixed it with a piece of piano wire. Simo Haiha, the farmer, saw a flaw in the sniper doctrine. He saw that a scope glinted in the snow, and he fixed it by using iron sights and the cold itself. Joe Foss, the farm boy, saw a flaw in the dogfighting doctrine. He saw that you couldn't outturn a zero, but you could outthink it with deflection shooting. Vasily Zaitsev, the shepherd, saw a flaw in modern warfare. He saw that breath control and stillness could defeat technology. Alvin York, the turkey hunter, saw a flaw in the way men fought. He saw that machine gunners, like turkeys, could be picked off from the back without the others noticing. Doris Miller, the mess attendant, saw a flaw in the system itself. He saw that the doctrine that said black men couldn't fight was a lie, and he proved it with action. And Francis Pegahmagabow, the Ojibwe hunter, saw a flaw in trench warfare. He saw that soldiers who stood and fought died, but hunters who stalked and waited survived. He didn't fight the war. He hunted it. These are the forgotten pages. The stories of men who didn't follow the manual, who trusted their ancestral knowledge, who brought the wilderness into the war. Francis Pegahmagabow died in 1952, but the lesson he taught lives on. In every military in the world, soldiers are taught the same thing: silent movement, patient observation, precise shooting, adaptation to terrain. They call it fieldcraft now. They call it stalking. They call it advanced reconnaissance. But Francis Pegahmagabow's people called it survival. They called it hunting. They called it the way of the Anishinaabe. They don't always say his name. But every time a sniper moves silently through enemy territory, every time a scout reads the land, every time a soldier becomes invisible, they're using the tricks Francis Pegahmagabow brought from the forests of northern Ontario. The mess attendant who became a warrior, the sharecropper's son who became a hero, the Ojibwe hunter who became the deadliest soldier of World War I. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the world wars. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.